Hello again, fellow kids. Today we dive into the transformations everyone went through during the interwar period, 1918 to 1930s, and basically the lessons learned from World War I and how such lessons were utilized during World War II. Let's begin. We are going to be starting this right after the Great War. France came out of the war as one of its victors, but at an extreme price. That being since, well, most of the fighting on the Western Front occurred on French soil, and thus a huge chunk of its territory has been reduced into rubble. And everyone was dead, but since they were the victors, they spent most of the interwar period chilling out, while still pulling some things here and there. Starting with one of the main projects they worked on before skimming through some of the others. I don't know. The Maginot Line. That being a line of fortifications placed along the Franco-German border, designed to take on any frontal assault infantry and armor. I'm going to assume that the designer was World War I vet. This was how France was going to win if Fritz ever decided to load another clip into his car. But there were many things that they were not taking any account for, like say for the past 20 years, Germany has been coming up with countless ways to breach said barriers, even testing them in front of everyone during the Spanish Civil War. Also, the Maginot happened to not really expand all the way to the Atlantic, not too smart, considering that the Germans didn't even invade through France in the last war, but through Belgium, which wasn't covered by the way. But as for the French arsenal, they have just been sitting around, as they were perfectly satisfied with what they had now. They shouldn't have been. Tank units mostly consisted of buffed FTs and other uncommon AFVs. Your average rifleman was equipped with just about the same gear as the last war, nothing really surprising. Their air force was just like any other air force at the time, nothing that special. As for their navy, don't bother, the British have got that covered. And besides some prototype crap here and there, nothing really changed for the French. Few were too proud of their first victory to really prep for the sequel.
Cheerio! Cheerio! Cheerio!
Now, after the Great War, the British and its Commonwealth entered the war with lots of new tech and knowledge, but like the French, they also took massive casualties during the war. But unlike the French, the British actually spent quite a bit of time toying with its army. They upgraded pretty much anything that had to do with the land, air, and sea units, starting with air units, more specifically, tank units. The Brits, like any other nation during the interwar period, saw the tanks' promising performance during the First World War, and thus expanded on such things. Their armor doctrine had two parts to it. They had buffed infantry tanks to smash enemy defenses and give the grunts some more firepower, while lighter and faster cruiser tanks exploited the breakthrough to ruin the enemy rear line. And this is the doctrine that they modeled most of their armor around, leading to some interesting design choices. One example would be the British Churchill, which was used as an infantry tank through all of World War II, which was equipped with some thick armor and arms, along with other nifty features, but their top speed was reduced to a jogging pace to stay in line with the marching infantry, while tanks such as the cruiser A-13 were fitted out with lighter arms and armor, but a powerful engine and proven suspension to exploit breakthroughs and cause chaos behind the line. The British armor was also more specialized and had some odd variation, leading to some jams over the factory. But as for the reality on the field, it didn't always work out, leading to some quite embarrassing losses. But no worries, because America could easily just refill said losses. As for your average grunt, nothing much. Still had, your average SMLE rifle, bolt action, and they're nice looking brodies. But the Air Force had some, more extreme changes. Production was streamlined whenever possible, which meant more planes for the boys to crash on training missions. By the start of the war, Britain had a pretty good Air Force, hosting models such as the Blenheim Bomber and Hurricane Fighter, which held up during the opening years of World War II. But as for the Navy, nothing really changed as far as anything was concerned towards the end of World War I and into the interwar period when it came to doctrine, as the Navy was mostly used to cover objectives and blockade shipping, with only one major engagement between British and German ships, that being the Battle of Jutland. The reason for that being, well, ships are expensive, and neither side wanted to risk any in a naval battle. But this kind of changes as time went on, and no one really cares. As for tech, we got lots to skim over. We got new battleships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and other toys whatever you want to mess with, which should be expected, as Britain was always known for their swanky navy and pretty stacked trading partner. But one thing they kind of forgot about was the submarine, and which also happened to be where Germany shoved most of their eggs into. and thus imports from American shipping were shaken about during the Second World War by German U-boats, something that they had to overcome later via ways to counter said U-boats. Though much more to learn, Britain does. Yeah, I should probably move on now.
What the schnitzel?
So, let's just say that after the Great War, Germany wasn't doing so hot. They ended up on the losing side of World War I, and now all the victors were expecting their spoils. The Allies, winning side, slapped a bunch of war reparations on them, and restricted Germany's army size to just about 100,000, and also banned any incorporations of modern vehicles, such as tanks and planes, and also restricted warship sizes to an absolutely pitiful limit. And if you wish to know the full bout, go read the Treaty of Versailles, the peace paper that made all this a thing, which in short, completely crippled the German economy and army alike. Now, unlike the Brits and Frenchies, though, old Fritz took his notes. Some of the bummed-out army command held up a survey on how and why they lost, which led to some interesting insights. They found that they pretty much had the whole modern war thing down pat, but maybe add some things here and there. And with this summary, they decided to expand on such things. What are these things? Well, we got stormtroopers for one, utilized to pierce the enemy front line and reek the rear lines, thus rendering trench warfare kind of kinked. Also, you usually had armor and artillery coordinating on the side to deal with some of the more beefy opponents, solving the whole combined arms part of modern war. But it wasn't until the Nazis came to power during the 1930s that the real innovations came around. Using their prior knowledge, the Germans did as much as they could, finding as many loopholes as mentally possible in the Versailles Treaty to improve on this new info, doing things such as training and experimenting with new Luftwaffe units and Panzer units out of country, in places such as the neutral Soviet Union to keep the Allies in the dark. They formulated many new tactics and toys to play with, including one very common World War II term, that being Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, which was basically more akin to the ultimate trump card against any static defenses that the Allies could put up, especially during the opening years of World War II. They also happened to invite some other peeps to the party, those being Italy, Japan, and technically, and I mean technically, Stalinland. And they're gonna try to gobble up the rest of the world, somehow. And then after expanding their armies, they started gobbling up all their neighbors, one by one. And it was only once the Nazis touched Poland that Britain and France responded with military action. The reason behind this was, well, most politicians in charge of Britain and France at that time hoped that they could just negotiate their way out of a war with Germany, using a tactic known as appeasement, which can be compared to a boomer trying to win a debate with a social justice warrior. It's just not going to happen. They're going to violate your rights faster than Germany violated the Geneva Convention. It's just not going to happen. I'm sorry. But once everything was said and done, eventually the Allies declared war, and it was on. But for some reason, they waited for the Nazis to make their first move, which happened to be a bit of an oof. Pretty soon they started to bite off more than they can chew, and that led to them facing off against 3 major superpowers, all lusting for their blood. So, you probably know how that's gonna end. In summary, they were ready for the sequel, but forgot the butter on their popcorn, and they only invited like 2 other people. And it turns out that they paid the cashier Monopoly money, and now the security is out to get some. America, after the First World War, mostly just chilled about after flexing their capitalist might once again, supplying everyone with munitions and giving the Hun a bloody nose, while everyone else busy to breaking his kneecaps and neutering his economy. As since America was on top of the world at that point in time, and everyone else seemed to be fine and dandy, all they really did was maintain what they had now, with independent projects here and there, because, you know, it was America. And so it wasn't until the 1930s that they really started to buff their military by an extreme margin. As for economy, well, they had the biggest one on planet Earth, so it wouldn't have been too hard to expand the military on short notice. And everyone else was either dead or reliant on American goods, so not too much to worry about externally. Not like anyone really wanted to, since, well, this isn't the America we all know and love today just yet. No. This one was not too keen on foreign relations, and tended to keep to themselves. Well, at least militarily. Besides from the fact that everyone outside the US was either dead or fighting for the motherland, the economy was booming, and everyone was zooming as the 20s rolled on. And everything was fine and dandy until, well, it wasn't. And the big sad hit the economy, soiling feelings and stripping people of a wallet and a job. And this also results in some funding issues while the economy is off to work, well, fixing the economy, because it's America. Now we are in the 1930s. Some angry mustache people are screaming at their neighbors, and everyone was starting to sweat off their brows. Also, the Japanese were getting a little bit rowdy. So the big boys began making preparations for a new world war, including the good old US of A. The Americans kept their small infantry force well equipped when it came to small arms, improving a semi-auto rifle in 1936 and topping out with, oh my god, look at this, a new Browning! Aw, so cool, man. As for armor innovation, that came along very slowly, as Army doctrine didn't really incorporate this very well, and it took the efforts of many officers, such as one Major General Chaffee of the General Staff, to build up a proper armored force, and replace horses as the new cavalry. America also began to look into paratroops as a cool new tactic to field, watching as the German Fallschirmjäger jumped countries all over Europe and began to organize a paratrooper unit itself in 1939, with the first mass jumps going down in August of 1940. Pretty cool, not gonna lie. As for air power, that was seen as a way to destroy the enemy's ability to fight, that way destroying industrial and administrative targets down on the home front, and thus it was expanded upon pretty quickly, and by the outbreak of the Second World War, they had a pretty nice force of aircraft, naval power, just like the British Navy, but bigger, and more modern, since you got those thick factories. But don't forget that the Big Sad was still a thing, and people were still depressed. But then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and now America's ready to get some. People flooded to staff the previously fledgling factories to fight the Axis overseas, which meant jobs, which meant that the Big Sad was no more. And it didn't take long for the Americans to swing back and basically drown the Axis with their thick factories and picking rifles. So in summary, America was mostly chilling at the start of the interwar years, and then the Big Sad hit, and gave everyone quite a bad rap until World War II came around, and gave America a reason to overdrive their industrial might once again, and to get selling. The Japanese, since the turn of the century, has been pushing buttons and waging war, with few breaks in between. Before the First World War, Japan has been occupying nearby Korea, with plans on invading next-door Manchuria, but they had to go through the Russians there first, who were trying to get that sweet, sweet warm water as usual. And so they did, resulting in the Russo-Japanese War, which played out like any other battle that went down during the Great War, except that this happened to be beforehand, and that the attacking force actually won this one. Now, before I move on to what went down next, I gotta talk about Japan's war doctrine, which was more or less a corruption of the Samurai Bushido Code, which is basically a warrior's code of conduct for the soldier on the go, similar to older European code of conduct known as chivalry, which is also dead. Thanks a lot, you fuck. Everything in Japanese society was built on this code of honor, which was so extreme that dying for your country was praised, and showing any sign of weakness resulted in individuals getting shadow banned from life. Though, how it all worked requires time that I don't have, so I'm just gonna give you some links, yeah. And while they were off sweeping up more of China, the First World War came around and gave the Japanese an excuse to join the Allies and sweep up more territory, that being German islands in the Pacific, which they did with relative ease. Once the war was over, Japan got to take part in the Versailles Treaty, on the side of the victors to keep their new spoils, and now we have reached the interwar period, finally, which mostly consisted of Japan invading China, committing some war crimes, and America throwing sanctions on them for said war crimes. And now the Navy and Army are bickering over who should devote more resources to, and oh, look at this new tech. Japan managed to develop a small, but decent tank force for its time, and decided to not touch it again. But as for their navy, they buffed to an extreme, and began to build thick battleships that few were given knowledge of. And oh, look at this! America just severed Japan's oil imports, and now they are in some hot water now, aren't they? They also want to invade Western Islands and bring them into their sphere of influence, as any good empire should. Now Japan is all salty, and they are quickly running out of resources to fuel their war machine. So what do? Well, they form a tripartite pact with the Italians and Germans and begin committing even more war crimes. So they jumped the Americans at Pearl Harbor and began snatching Western Islands, well, west of Hawaii, which doesn't sound very honor-like of them, but okay. And so now they have a temporary upper hand, but they are still running out of resources, and these Americans are giving them quite the bunny nose. And so they push further with their navy into Midway, with hopes of taking out the garrison there. And then they lose 4 aircraft carriers, one of the biggest oceans a nation could possibly have. And now, almost 6 months into the campaign, they are already on the back foot. Why is this such a big deal? Because, well, their factories only make rice, and ships are stupid expensive. And now America's navy is trying to stack out the Japanese. So they start pulling more inexpensive surprises. Kamikaze planes are now a thing. Well, they already were, but now even more so. Which are basically manned cruise missiles, who ram into land and sea targets, giving people quite a scare. And island garrisons are ordered to fight to the last man, in which they unfortunately do. But to their surprise, America was in it for the long run, and Japan was running out of steam quickly. Also, their adversary to the north decided to try out some of that sweet ooh juice and began to eye out Japan. Not so good. So in the end, Japan was salty and wanted more stuff, so they attacked the Americans, hoping that their public would just give up and give them the victory royale. But that did not happen.
Alright, boys. Let's get poppin'.
Alright, for the motherland of... Russia wasn't doing so hot, even before the Great War, with public morale already being at rock bottom. And it looks the Japanese sink on the Baltic Fleet. Good job, Polska. Good job, good job. But that did not stop us from joining the Great War, because screw it, am I right? And then they got whipped by German, and I'm not gonna do this anymore. While that was happening, we have a new communist revolution going on. And oh look, the Tsar just got murdered by said communist, and now Russia's in a civil war on top of all that. But somehow, even during all this, people were able to invent new shit to kill people with. For one, they entered the war with an armored tricycle, a Cohan automatic rifle, that being the Federov Avtomat, which was very similar in function to its future offspring, the Kalashnikov, while was deployed like a light machine gun. And oh look, oh yes, it looks like Thomas the Train decided to fight for the motherland. Alright then. As for tactics, they don't exist, but all of these cool things were halted in their tracks once the 1917 revolutions came up, and now everyone's grabbing their popcorn. Though the first match didn't last long, the Bolsheviks easily swayed the Russian heartland cities and were beginning to spread out. But yeah, then a counter-revolution shut up to take its place on the world stage, because of course it does. And so in this new civil war, we have two teams. We have the White Army, which was basically just the anti-communist team, led by old generals from the previous monarchy, and liked committing suicide. We have the White Army, which was basically just the anti-communist team, led by old generals from the previous monarchy, and liked committing genocide as a hobby. And on the other team, we have the familiar Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Lenin. The bunch of commies also liked to kill their peasantry, the free potatoes, of course. Both were starving, had low morale, and killed peasants as a hobby. And desertions were rampant on both sides, but one big difference was, well, the Reds controlled all the industrial centers in the country, while the Whites had, well, whatever was left. Also, the Allies were not going to do anything about it either, as well fighting a war in Russia is never the brightest idea. And so, after much purging and killing peasants for free potatoes, White resistance eventually dissipated into a every-man-for-himself deal. And also in the meanwhile, Poland shows up and kicks the Soviets' ass, but we're not gonna talk about that. And so the Soviets kept on purging, everyone else just sat and watched with occasional interference. Also, meanwhile, Lenin dies, and we have some leadership changes, leading to Stalin's takeover. And now we are in the year 1924, and this is when the crazy stuff goes down, as if what happened prior wasn't crazy enough. Stalin begins rapid industrialization in the form of his 5-year plans, which was basically the nationalization of everything, in an attempt to making all units, from farms to factories, more productive, by treating the whole country as a concentration camp, of course. Meanwhile, the Nazis decided to show up in Germany, which were also socialist, but more nationalistic. And to confuse you more, this title was only in the name. In reality, they operated more like a crime syndicate of all things. But they are also state-approved, so, you know what? They just hate everyone. I'm just gonna leave it like, yeah, I'll just leave it at that, yeah. And fortunately for Stalin, this was happening right as his 5-year plans were beginning to bear fruit. So we got some new tech. Lots of new tanks. We got this shiny sloped one, a race car tank, a shiny sloped tank but thicker, and Big Papa over there. Also, this Hydra of a tank right here, along with an assortment of older designs. As for planes, we just got a bunch of yaks, nothing big. Navy, don't bother. As for tactics, there aren't any. Individual grunts, they might as well be cavemen. But the one big thing going for the Soviets was the ridiculous manpower. Meanwhile, Stalin decided to sick these new toys on their weaker neighbors, form a buffer zone against the Germans. Some went down good, and some not as much. But in the end, Stalin now had a decent army and a decent amount of land between them and Germany. It was soon time to begin lunging towards the German mainland. But then the Nazis jumped them first. And so it is over. We have covered the majority of major factions, and now I guess we can just chill. Gotta go through the summaries. France did improve some things here and there, but was swiftly defeated by Fritz, who actually took the time to improve on World War I lessons. Britain was a mixed bag. They had an arsenal to brag about and some decent tactics about, but like France, was still fighting the last war. Germany, after languishing in defeat for a while, got some staff changes, including one angry mustache man, and they went all out on their arsenal, possessing one of the most modern armies of the time, and focused on swift, concentrated offensives to carry itself to victory. Maybe. America and its industry supplied the Allied powers during the majority of the war and jump-started military wares during the 1930s, just in time for the Second World War. Japan mostly expanded on their navy and air forces, with armor few and far between, but had initial successes on the Pacific Front. But then, America outpaced them. Russia was just a mess the whole way through, but still managed to start World War II with a decent-sized army, with many more millions soon to be conscripted because, well, it's Russia. And Italy... Other nations that were not included, such as Canada or Australia, were more or less Control-C, Control-V variants of British and American munitions and British tactics, so why would I waste my time on them? And now it is truly over.
Private property